God kväll. Vi fick möjlighet att prata med Bill Browder som är finansman och vd för Untitled Chapter. Men ni känner förmodligen till honom bäst som mannen som anmält både Swedbank, Nordea och Danske Bank för penningtvätt i Baltikum. På Skype från London pratade vi om var pengarna kommer ifrån och vad han anser att konsekvenserna för bankerna ska bli. Då rullar klippet. Great to have you on the show, Mr. Browder.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
To start with, could you please describe for our viewers your interest in the alleged money laundering that has taken place in the Nordic banks?
So about 9 years ago, my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, my Russian lawyer, was murdered in Russian police custody. He was murdered for uncovering and exposing a $230 million tax rebate fraud which had been engineered by senior officials in the Russian government. And the Russian government has since covered up all responsibility for those who took part in his murder. And so we decided if we couldn't get justice inside of Russia, we should at least look for justice outside of Russia and look for who got the money and who laundered the money that led to the murder of Sergei Magnitsky. And for 9 years, we've been on this chase after the money. And when we find it, we then file criminal complaints against the people who received the money, and we file criminal complaints against the bankers that laundered the money. And that's what led us to Swedbank in Sweden, Danske Bank in Denmark, and Nordea Bank in Finland.
Okay, so where is this money coming from?
So the money has come from financial crimes committed in Russia. And in this particular case, it comes from the $230 million theft of Russian government money of taxes that we paid to the Russian government, which was stolen from the Russian government.
Okay. We know that there are connections to Ukraine ex-President Yanukovych and US President Donald Trump's former campaign chief Paul Manafort. Have you found any more information regarding connections to people of political importance?
Well, so our investigation is very clear and very narrow. We're looking for just who's responsible for the money connected to the Magnitsky murder. And so we have not found any connection to Donald Trump. And apparently from articles we've read, some of the same holding companies, accounts, banks have been involved in money for Yanukovych from Ukraine and Paul Manafort, but we've not specifically looked at that in our investigation.
Okay, I see. Do you believe that the banks simply did a poor job in terms of due diligence, or are you alleging further malfeasance here?
Well, I think this is the job ultimately for law enforcement. What we can see in case of Swedbank is that we see $176 million of suspicious transactions connected to the Magnitsky case, going through Swedbank's branches in the Baltics and in Sweden. And the red flags are very clear. They're very obvious to us from the outside. And so then the question is this naivete, is this negligence, or is this complicity? And only proper police investigation will be able to determine that.
Yeah, I understand. But in terms of punishment for the people in charge of the bank, CEO of Danske Bank and Swedbank have both stepped down. In your opinion, is this enough?
This is nowhere near enough. So you look at it and you say to yourself, okay, let's just assume the worst for a second and assume that there was active involvement of bankers inside these banks in this money laundering. And if the worst that happens to the people who are overseeing those bankers is that they lose their jobs, that's not a very big incentive in the future for people not to do this type of thing again. I believe that there has to be criminal responsibility for the bankers that did the laundering, and there has to be severe penalties for those who are managing those bankers if they did nothing about it.
Yeah. We know that the banks might be facing huge fines from American authorities. How much do you believe these fines will be, and what bank is most likely to get penalized?
Well, we don't know whether the banks will or will not receive fines from American authorities, and we don't know whether the banks will receive fines from European authorities.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because in a certain way, these fines create all sorts of wrong incentives. So who gets punished in this situation are the shareholders of these banks.
Exactly.
And at the same time, the management who are responsible, the worst that happens to them is they lose their jobs. And so it seems to me that the punishment should be vastly more extreme on the management and less extreme on the shareholders who had nothing to do with this. They were just hoping that the management would do their job properly and not lead them into this type of mess.
Yes, yes. So there is a possibility that banks who have been accused of doing money laundering can be banned from trading in US dollars. Do you believe that this could happen to any of the Nordic banks?
Well, I know for sure it's happening to some of the Baltic banks that have done this in Lithuania and Latvia, Estonia. And then the question is whether this will be widened out to these Nordic banks. And the answer is I think that will depend very much on the facts that emerge as to whether how involved and how much the management knew about this while it was going on. If it turns out that the management of these banks were aware of these money laundering scandals and allowed them to perpetrate over a long period of time, that would probably be a very negative signal for U.S. regulators in terms of whether these banks can be trusted not to do that in the future.
Yes, yes, of course. And so far you have gone after Danske Bank, Swedbank and Nordea. Will you be going after any more of the banks in the Nordics?
Well, we will go where the evidence leads us.
Right.
We also go after banks in other parts of the world. We recently went after banks in Austria, including Raiffeisen Bank. And so we have no specific agenda about Nordic banks. We're just looking for where the money laundering occurred, where the evidence leads us. Yeah. And when we find that evidence, we file it with the law enforcement authorities of the country.
We know that SEB had a subsidiary, LWM Holdings, which they sold in 2014, and this company was involved in the Panama Papers. Are there reasons to believe that SEB will be next in this money laundering scandal?
I really cannot comment on other banks until we've fully analyzed the information and decided to submit or not submit a complaint to law enforcement. I don't want to speculate on SEB or any other banks.
Yeah, I understand. Okay. So you were in Sweden not too long ago trying to implement the Sergei Magnitsky Act. First of all, can you briefly explain what that is?
So the Sergei Magnitsky Act was named after my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who was murdered for being a whistleblower against Russian government corruption. The Magnitsky Act is a piece of legislation which freezes the assets and bans the visas of people who commit human rights abuses in Russia or anywhere in the world. It now exists in 6 countries: the United States, Canada, the UK, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And we believe that Sweden should be the 7th country to have a Magnitsky Act. Sweden shouldn't be encouraging torturers and murderers to come to Sweden or keep their money in Swedish banks. And this is particularly relevant now that we've seen how involved Swedish banks have been in laundering Russian money.
Yeah. So what was the response from Sweden?
Well, the lawmakers from the opposition parties are fully in favor of the Magnitsky Act. And lawmakers from the governing party so far have been a little bit less enthusiastic, and we're hoping that we can change that in the near future.
So you've said in previous interviews that your goal is to get justice for Sergei Magnitsky. Yeah. What does that mean, and when do you consider yourself having reached that goal?
Well, it's sort of an evolving goal. I mean, justice for Sergei Magnitsky is probably going to take a long time. But on top of justice for Sergei Magnitsky, the other thing which I'm trying to do is create a legacy for Sergei Magnitsky. Right. He gave his life in my service. He gave his life trying to expose the truth. And his legacy should be a set of laws around the world which create huge punishments for people who do bad things. And those punishments will hopefully create a disincentive for people to do bad things, and hopefully will save lives. And from my perspective, that would be a great legacy for him, and it will probably take a long time to achieve that legacy.
So final question. I am meeting with Per Bolund, Minister for Financial Markets, on Wednesday. Is there anything you would like me to ask him?
Well, what's become clear to me is that the laws that exist as they're written today don't provide strong enough disincentive for Swedish banks to participate in these types of things going forward. And my question for him is, what kind of new laws or amendment to the old laws is he intending to put in place which will provide really terrible consequences for people in the banks that do these things in the future?
I understand. Thank you very much for being on the show today and for answering our questions.
Thank you.